I'm thrilled to be joined by Gordon Chang. He's an author, a commentator with real expertise about the relationship between the West and China. Gordon, thank you so much for sparing me a few minutes after your compelling address a moment ago.
Well, thank you so much, Amanda. I really appreciate this.
You've got some really important messages for Australians to share about the way we should be preparing for China's outlook into the future. Tell me, what should we be doing now to prepare for what's ahead?
The most important thing is to protect Australian society from what's going to happen in China, which means severing trade, investment, technical cooperation. And I know that that sounds extreme, but we got to remember that China's on the warpath. And if it invades Taiwan, Japan, the Philippines, or whatever, no one's going to be selling anything to China. So the time for Australia to diversify is now. The important thing for the United States is to do the same thing. Unfortunately, President Biden doesn't look at it that way. But the point is that China is pushing other countries away. It is undermining foreign business. And so we don't really have a choice. We've got to defend and protect ourselves.
One of the things that was a steep learning curve, I think, for Australians over the last 5 to 10 years is the idea that in the West we often think of defence and commerce as two separate buckets that don't really mix. And in our interactions with China, we came to see that one is used as fair game for the other in the CCP's worldview. The adaptation, though, in Australia and the rest of the world seems to be quite slow. Does that need to be faster?
It needs to be faster, and you shouldn't beat yourself over this because the United States is even slower than you guys. The point is that China is now moving back to totalitarianism. Xi Jinping demands absolute control and obedience from the Communist Party, and he demands absolute control and obedience of the Communist Party over the Chinese people. So they don't make distinctions between civil and military or between commerce and national defense. And we've got to understand the nature of that Chinese system in order for us to develop responses that make sense. Now, President Biden's trying to maintain this idea, well, American companies can invest into Chinese tech sectors if they're, quote unquote, civilian. There's this policy of military-civil fusion, which means that everything that a civilian company has can be directly pipelined to the Chinese military. So we need to understand the nature of China's unitary system.
I think the West has been slow to learn that in a pretty serious way. How do we help to make sure that free trade with other nations is a big part of the solution?
Well, I think that it really depends on political leadership at the top. There are a couple of things going on. Xi Jinping, as I mentioned, is cutting China off from the rest of the world. So that's having an effect on the way business views China. But we also need political leaders like Albanese, like Biden, like others, to sort of speed up the process. And they can do that because they've got extraordinary authority and powers. And so if they were to do that, to give business even more incentive for what makes sense from a national point of view, that would be better. But unfortunately, for instance, President Biden is extremely slow on that. And I hope that Prime Minister Albanese leads the way, because certainly we do not have a leader in that regard.
How real is the risk to Taiwan right now? And if it's severe, how soon do we think that could turn into something of a hot military situation?
Well, Taiwan has its next presidential election on January 13th, 2024. So many people, including me, think that China is going to it's going to huff and puff, it's going to threaten, but it probably won't decide to invade Taiwan before then. But we never know, because Xi Jinping views the world in a very different way. And also, there's always the issue of accident, quote-unquote accident. China is intercepting planes and ships in the global commons in a very dangerous way. One of them can turn into an accident, and that could lead to a spiral downward. So we got to be prepared at any moment, because China is provoking this. It's nothing that we can really do at this point, because Xi Jinping believes it's in Beijing's interest to do this.
Yeah, okay. And finally, there's been a real strategy adopted, it seems, in Australia of soft influence and allowing Chinese Australians to take on a role in our community that is ever escalating in its importance, but with loyalties divided. between Australia and the CCP. To what extent is that kind of softer influence being used in a dangerous way to Western institutions and democracy?
Well, basically, the Communist Party, through its United Front Work Department and through its other arms, has weaponized Chinese. This is very difficult for free societies to talk about because this is race, but China has tried to appeal to, for instance, Chinese Americans based on their race. Also, they coerce relatives back in China to get Chinese Americans to do certain things. And that's true in Canada and in other free societies as well. So really what we have to do is to have a very honest conversation. And this is important. You know, I view this in the context of Chinese Americans, that Chinese Americans have got to make a choice, because many of them have made choices which really look very disturbing. And other Americans, I think, have a right to say, well, where do your loyalties lie? Well, this is true in your society as well. And I know that it's hard for us to do that because this is an issue of race, but it's also an issue of national survival.
Really important that we both protect Chinese Australians in our community from that coercion, as well as making it safe and valued for them to clearly align their loyalties with Australia.
Absolutely. And that's the nature of government. That's the responsibility of government, is to protect its citizens. You know, many Chinese, like my dad, you know, just fled China. For a reason, right? For a reason, right. and my dad's case is a little bit different, but what we're seeing right now, for instance, in the U.S. southern border, there's been an unprecedented surge of Chinese migrants. And these are not poor Chinese. These are Chinese who are wealthy enough to pay the cartels, you know, pretty big sums of money, $35,000 a shot, to get into the U.S. They're risking their lives, and they're doing that because they can't live in China anymore. And we have a responsibility to protect people, but we've also got to make sure that that once Chinese get here, that they are not under the coercive influence of the Communist Party.
Time for Western governments to step up. Thank you so much for having a chat with me, Gordon Chang.
Thank you, Amanda.